So let's take a look at some geography here. What are we looking at? Well, this is clearly a picture from space, and I think it's from the International Space Station. But the question is, what continent or what country even are we looking at? Well, let's take a look at the next one. We'll have maybe a better idea. This is the entire continent, and what I want to take a look at carefully is, you'll see this is Japan here. And, well, this is Australia down here. But you'll notice something. This is Korea. Well, it's the Korea Peninsula. This is southern Korea, and this is North Korea. It's a big blank area. And the question is, why is it like this? Why is one area light with lights on it and the other one not? You'll notice over here, too, this is Africa. This is Europe over here. Russia's up at the top. It's dark because nobody really lives there. So the case of Africa, it's interesting. The South Africa is the bright area down here. While there are people living in East Africa rather, it's not clear. So what we've got here is a bit of a picture of, well, economic. Let's go on to the next one and take a look at this next one. We've got a bit of an idea here of, in effect, economic development of rich and poor. This is another place to look at. This is the Caribbean. You'll notice this is Miami up here. This is the southern tip of Florida. There's Key West down here. And the bright one here, this is Puerto Rico. This is Jamaica. You can see Cuba, which is interesting. Here's Havana over here, but which is relatively lit. But take a look at this island here. This is Hispaniola, roughly divided in half. On the right-hand side is the Dominican Republic, and on the left-hand side is Haiti. And once again, it's quite visible, the difference between the two. The rich portion, if you call it that way, or the developed portion, and the relatively poor portion. We're measuring now economic growth by access to electricity. In effect, this is an important part. It's a very important development in the in the 20th century in particular. Electric light started around 1900 or so, and they've spread now around the world. I want to look at this idea of economic growth in the context of our macroeconomic model. So I'll repeat it here. We've got the LRAS curve, which is known, I'll call it the long-run aggregate supply curve. You'll notice down below here I've got potential real GDP. So what we're looking at, this line is going to represent where the economy is capable of producing in the long run. So in the short run, at any given moment, this line is fixed. That's why it's vertical. So what we're going to talk about in this particular lecture is what would make this curve shift to the left or right. It's very important to understand that John Maynard Keynes, when he developed his theory, he wasn't worried about this particular curve. He assumed that potential real GDP was fixed. So his model, the Keynesian model as originally intended, was a short-run model in which, for example, for some reason, the economy could be in this yellow area where it would be below potential, and he referred to this as a recession or a depression. And he developed models. In fact, the entire model was designed to think of political policies, government policies that would move the economy out of this yellow area and back to its long-run potential. Incidentally, it can happen under certain circumstances where the economy is above potential, in which case, for the short run, in a short period of time, it can be above its potential, achieving more than would normally. So in this, we'll be looking at this later for the remainder of the course. We'll be looking at under what circumstances, what the government can do to alleviate or solve this problem particularly the economy below potential or even above potential. But for this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the long-run aggregate supply curve, this vertical line, to find out what would make it shift to the right or left, and particularly for the right, because then we're talking about economic growth. So let's take a look at that now. In general economic theory, and this is growth theory, so it's not really a Keynesian theory, although now is put in the context of a macroeconomic model. We imagine something like a function, a mathematical function, in which we take various inputs, let's say materials, that would be maybe natural resources, then sometimes energy. Different models approach this different ways. We take L, which is usually labor, people working, and then K is physical capital, that's machines, buildings, roads, the various infrastructure of a country, including the human capital, the software and so on that's used, combined in some kind of a function dependent on technology, management skills, and so on. These combined together determine the potential real GDP of a country, that YP, the long-run aggregate supply curve. So the idea here is that if a country were to have more of these various inputs, or have a function that was maybe using technology, more advanced technology, then the potential would increase. So looking at it in this way, what would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, for example? Well, for example, having immigration, a larger labor force, more human physical capital, building roads, infrastructure, things like this. Incidentally, adding physical means adding to the stock of real capital. So the way to do this would be through savings. That means to say the country produces something, it's possible to consume it immediately or to put it aside and, in effect, use it as investment to add to the physical stock. So in this sense, we'd say saving is a form of not consuming, which means the physical capital is larger in the country. Another way to look at it is opening to trade, easier to do deals, new technology, better management, and so on. And the effect of this is these various ideas. This is classical growth theory, standard economic growth theory. The effect is that the potential of the country to produce more is going to shift to the right. So at the same time, well, what kind of things would happen to shift the ability of a country to produce less in the long run? Things like, well, a destruction of physical capital, a war of some sort, fewer people when people emigrate, leave the country. If there is restrictions on trade, makes it more difficult for people to deal with one another. Question of losing human capital is kind of bizarre because you sort of think, is it possible to forget something? Is it possible to destroy knowledge? But it's relevant in the following sense, is that knowledge, things like the ability to read and write, or knowledge of calculus, or accounting measures, or various types of ways that we do things, we're not born with these things. So in effect, what it means is that each generation must pass on to the next generation the various knowledge of how to do these things. And it's possible that we've seen this in human history, where for a variety of reasons that one generation forgets how to transmit this knowledge to the next generation, and as a result, in the future, people are not capable of knowledge of how to do certain things. Think of something like sailing boats. People nowadays don't know how to sail largely. Some people do, but many people, whereas 200 years ago, they were quite commonly understood. So certain things can be forgotten over time. The effect of this, of course, is something like a civil war. It's a good example. Civil war is going to destroy capital. It's going to kill people, working age people in particular. And so as a result, the potential of the country to produce more is going to shift to the left. So another way to view this is to say, well, what determines economic growth? That is, what would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right? And in simple terms, in economics, we refer to this as labor productivity. Productivity means the amount of real GDP that can be produced per worker. And so then the real question underneath it is, well, what increases labor productivity? The problem a little bit to determine this is that real GDP per worker is in effect the similar as real GDP per capita. So in effect, it's a tautology. We're saying, well, to be rich, you have to be able to have more per person. And it's a difficult thing to measure empirically. But again, a basic principle of this in economics, we'd say standard growth theory is to say, well, having more physical capital, more roads, more airports, more buildings and so on, assuming that they're well used, more infrastructure. Also at the same time, more human capital, better education, people in better health, more capable of working, natural resources, going back to the Clem idea, and also having technology management skills. Increasingly, now, economists are beginning to think of things like the rule of law. By this we mean easier to trade. So by the rule of law, we would say things like the property law and contract law. Property law means it's very clear what you own. So you know that somebody can't arbitrarily take it away from you. At the same time, contract law refers to what you can trade, what are the conditions of a deal, of a trade, an exchange of some sort. And in many countries, this is not clear at all. Property law, in many poor countries in particular, it's because it's not clear what a person owns. And at the same time, if there's a deal of some sort, the deal goes sideways, it doesn't work, there's no recourse. It's difficult to know. I'd add in myself as well, my own experience of living in different countries is to note that wars of jealousy or debates of envy and deciding whether something is fair, somebody has more than somebody else, this can often make a country very, very poor. If people get involved in issues of saying that that's not correct, it's not fair that this happened this way, I've found that this is often the case. Determining why a country might be poor. Looking back historically, there's been many theories and ideas about things like religion. Is a particular religion, does that encourage economic development or economic growth? Is democracy a requirement for economic growth? What about geography? Some people believe that, well, countries that are near the equator are poor, countries near the north or away from the equator are rich. But for each of these examples, in fact, you can find a counterexample. Singapore is almost exactly on the equator. It's one of the richest countries in the world. Religion, it's hard to say. There's countries that are Buddhist or Confucian or atheist, and they're rich. So there's no geography, democracy, even democracy. There's examples of countries that are quite rich, and there's not democratic involvement. This is a complex question, and it's something that if you're curious, you should really pursue it. It's very relevant. Take a quick glance at this idea, and I want to compare Canada and Argentina, just arbitrarily. I mentioned before the idea that in Canada, about 100 years ago, 1911, about 33 of about 100 people in Canada were involved in agriculture, producing food. And about 100 years later, only roughly two of 100 people are involved in producing food. Now, bear in mind that we import some food, like oranges, for example, but for the most part, most of the food we eat in Canada, bread, meat, basic foodstuffs like even vegetables, are produced here in Canada. That's true for chicken, milk, cheese, things like that. So that means to say that in Canada, this was true 100 years ago, it's true today, we can largely feed ourselves, but we don't need so many people to do it. Now, why did this happen? Well, an increase in labor productivity, largely maybe transportation and maybe refrigeration. The effect, though, is that 31 people can do something else. And so as a result, those 31 people can do other things, which means that the GDP per Canada in Canada is higher than it otherwise would have been, and our long-run aggregate supply potential GDP has shifted to the right. Another way to view it, too, is to say in that 100-year period, Canada's population increased about 4 times, but the number of Canadians required to produce fell by a third. Now, just quickly to compare this with Argentina, about 100 years ago, 1900 or so, GDP per capita in Canada and Argentina were about the same. No difference between the two countries in that regard. Incidentally, both Canada and Argentina both have lots of natural resources. They have electricity, hydroelectricity, mines, and very similar population in terms of education and so on. And yet, 100 years later, 2000, 2010, the GDP per capita in Canada is about 2.5 times higher than Argentina. So the question then is, well, why? Argentina is better off now than it was in 1900, but Canada is much better off. And if you look back at the history of it, you start to realize, well, there were a variety of things that happened. Argentina suffered inflation. It had a military dictatorship for a while. There's been many restrictions on trade with the outside world. In many ways, Argentina has pursued a policy that economic policies that have just made it poorer. Now, and then it becomes a complex question of understanding why that happened and how it happened. But it's just one example amongst many that we can look at.